Well, thanks for coming on, Matt. So I've always been interested in the issue of education, but in particular, I've been thinking a lot about it lately. And I wanted to, usually go through people's backstory. Before we get to that, want to start with, I've heard more and more over the years by people whom I respect in various ways, attacks on education itself, who said education is not that valuable. If we look at the things that actually influence people's success in life, it's, major thing would be like IQ, and education doesn't impact IQ. There's the kind of attacks by Brian, going blank on his name. He's a free market economist. I'm sure it will come to me. That is, if we look at the evidence for, can we actually build skills that are applicable in other fields? Like if you teach children how to add, subtract, multiply, does that carry over into their ability to think critically? No, the evidence says that it doesn't. All that sort of thing. What's your take on the evidence that education actually matters that much anyway?
Um, so there's a question as to what education is. So no, I don't think anybody would deny that learning is important. And there are certain things that are valuable to learn, that you need to learn, that you need to, and those things range from particulars, kind of particular skills like basic operations and literacy, to very general thinking skills or even characterological things that are learned. And people who attack education usually say it's like there's a kind of unschooling progressive line of this within education, and then outside of education there's just an anti-education line. Just like, screw all that stuff that you have to learn. Like, what matters is learning how to learn and staying nimble for the future, and these deep kind of transferable thinking skills. That is, I mean, first of all, it's a false alternative. Like, the way that you get good at general things and the way that you build up your character and your thinking skills is by learning substantive things. And that can happen. And the question is whether or not that can happen systematically. And education is it's a kind of systematic treatment. It's saying, yes, there are amazing people. There are amazing autodidacts out there, like the Ben Franklins and the Frederick Douglasses. Like, those people turn themselves into great human beings from nothing. And they either have no education or the opposite of education. And you can kind of hold them up as exemplars. And I hold them up as exemplars of human beings and of learning. And the question of education is, what happened there? What went right there? Is there a way that we can systematically scaffold that and offer that to everybody, and not say, this is something that, for the exceptional few autodidacts that can kind of pull themselves together out of really crappy inputs, those people are going to be fine. And I mean, I don't know. Like, it's like it feels like a very narrow argument to me. I think that education is immensely, immensely valuable, and that usually what people are actually criticizing when they criticize education is the fact that most education today sucks.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about that for a second too, because so I think there's the standard complaint, which I agree with, and I think is really tragic, about, like, kids who come out of school barely able to read, certainly not invested in reading and ambitious about reading. The same thing with math and science. But one thing that I don't think it's talked about as much, and you mentioned the kind of like autodidacts, is the impact of, let's just call it a subpar education, on kind of the best minds, and the sort of deprivation that inflicts upon them. And, I didn't have the worst education by any means, but once I discovered, like, being around real thinkers and teachers and people who like were interested in knowledge, and compared that to what I spent, more than a decade being housed in places where essentially every enjoyment I had came from the fact that I ignored what they were teaching me and just read a bunch of philosophy. Like, I think that's really outrageous and tragic. And it's sort of like, well, they're smart. They'll be fine.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about what you would have wanted for yourself, and the things that, like, you encounter, you're like, man, I wish I knew more about that, or I wish I had a better basis on this. And I mean, a lot of people have this for narrow things like, man, why didn't somebody teach me personal finance in school? This isn't something that I should have to learn as like a 35-year-old adult or whatever. But for other people, it's like you have no sense of what happened in history. Every time it comes up, you feel kind of like a C. And it's important. Like it matters for the kinds of claims that people make, your understanding of where things came from, your understanding of geopolitics, your understanding of your local politics, your current situation, your understanding of human beings. And I think I think it's a minority of people who thinks, yeah, I wish I had learned less of that, or I wish I had learned that. Like that didn't matter. I wish I had just cut that out and not. It's like what you want is to have learned it well and to have an understanding of it. And can a teacher help you do that? Can educational resources help you do that? Is there something like, even if it's not a teacher, like what's something that you engage with? Like, a lot of people, at least of my generation and older, talk about like the Cosmos, that Carl Sagan miniseries being really impactful on them. There's a million things like that. And the promise of education is that it's all like that it's all incredibly inspiring, incredibly rich, lights you on fire to connect with things and to be curious at the right ages when you're naturally curious in those things. And then, yeah, you become an adult and you're learning as you go. And you have a whole life of that. But the question is, can there be a foundation of that? And what happens when there's not a foundation of that? Like what's the effect of the deprivation?
And what was your personal experience like? And in particular, I'm curious how you got from that to saying I'm going to go into the field of education, because I can imagine at least like one or two major possibilities. One is I had an amazing education and wanted to share that with others, and the other is I had an awful one and then realized the value of it.
My education was mediocre overall, I would say. I had like I went to public schools in the Southeast. They were above average public schools for the area. I remember thinking as an elementary student, as an older elementary student, and as a teenager, actively thinking like, this could be so much better. Like, this is how I would do it. Like, this is how I would do this teacher's job, or this is how I present the material. And so that kind of strain of thinking, like what is actually going on here and what they're teaching us and what would be the actual exciting way to do it, I've just always sort of had in the back of my mind. I had no intention of going into education. My interests were mainly in, they were more academic and intellectual. I went to grad school for philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy. I remember when I first started teaching, you might think like, oh, you go to get a PhD in philosophy, you like know that teaching is going to be a big part of your job forever. But and I knew that in the back of my mind, but it's not something that most people who go into academia, it's at the forefront of their mind, unfortunately. And I was terrible at it. I was a terrible teacher. And I was like mousy and introverted, and my students hated my classes and I hated teaching. And I had a real moment where I said, what am I doing here? Like, I'm signing myself up for 60 years of misery if I don't actually enjoy this. What is actually the function of this? Can I turn it around? And I totally turned it around. I mean, it changed my teaching, it changed my whole personality. And I really dedicated myself to education, educating my students in philosophy and cognitive science and the things that I was teaching. And that strain is part of what eventually led me to say, maybe I want my career to be more about education and less about academic research and kind of being in academia, and to explore K-12, early childhood, which is, where I've landed.
Yeah, teaching is so interesting because like I have not really done any of what I would call teaching. I've done speaking. And one of the things I've realized is how different that is from, because I'm friends with a lot of teachers, there's a big difference between presenting material for people to digest in a way that you think will be appealing and digestible, and then actually helping them acquire knowledge and skills. So if you hand an adult, like, here's a way of viewing the world, and then, you don't take any responsibility for them doing anything with that, but, some do, some don't. That's sort of like, the irresponsibility and freedom that is fun about speaking. But on the other hand, your ability to like impact them in an ongoing way is much more limited.
It's really, I think that there's continuity between the two. Like, there's no kind of bright line as to when, let's say you're writing a book or giving a talk versus educating someone, when it becomes kind of education And when it's not, it's all education in some ways. And as an author, you're thinking about things like, what's motivating about this? Where's my audience coming in? What is my goal here? What's actually going to change people's minds or get people to think? But when you're teaching, especially when you're teaching live or when you're designing a course, and you really get to say, what's like an assignment or a problem that I could give my students to work on that would totally throw them for a loop and create cognitive dissonance and make them realize that they don't understand, you know, what they think they understand, they don't understand, and to get them thinking. That is, it's a distinct activity, and it's really fun and really engaging. There's this great educator, math educator who I like, Dan Meyer, who says, if you want students to take aspirin, you've got to give them a headache. And a lot of good teaching like involves kind of like figuring out how to give students, you know, kind of like throw students for a loop and give them headaches and make them realize that they don't actually know what keeps the satellite in space, and they don't understand gravity, or they don't understand fractions or whatever it is that you're teaching them in a way that's exciting to them and enticing, and they want to resolve it. And it's creating these mysteries.
Well, I just remember the first time that I encountered a teacher who actually did that. Now, it's shocking. I literally did not get that kind of format of teaching or that approach to teaching my entire like formal education. And then a mutual friend of ours, Onkar Gate, who teaches at the Ayn Rand Institute's Objectivist Academic Center, that's exactly how he was approaching teaching Ayn Rand's philosophy. And it was, I remember like multiple reactions to it. One is it's extremely motivating because you come in thinking you understand a certain point, and then he'll ask a certain question or pose a certain problem. You realize you don't, and that's exciting because it means you can reach a new level of knowledge. But it was, how would you put it? It was impressive as to the kind of like thinking that would have to go into, all right, how do I take an issue that people think they understand and not, and raise, like, what is the real question that to raise in their mind? Because it's not just like posing riddles to somebody. And
It's what is the real question to raise in their mind, and what is the real question to raise in their mind in such a way that they're going to own the question, because there is no knowledge that's not self-created. Like, I mean, this is one of the deep facts about human learning and human agency, that like you can't give somebody knowledge. You like, knowledge is something that a person has to build for themselves, but what you can do is you can, with their permission, kind of get inside their heads and get them to see a question they can then own, and then help them kind of walk through the steps to an answer, or to one possible answer to that question. And that it's a kind of therapy-like process that is, it gets really deep, both into like human nature and into the particular topic that you're talking about. I just have one example that I like to use a lot with my, I currently do a lot of Montessori training of early childhood teachers, and Montessori is big into independence and practical life. And one of the hallmarks of Montessori is that very, very young children do practical things on their own. So we like teach, you know, 1.5 and 2-year-olds how to put on their own jacket. For example, there's this whole like flip flop over the top method where they lay out their jacket and they can put it on. It's very cute. And so I take my trainees in this Montessori theory course, and I'm like, how many of you were in Montessori school? And like 1 out of 20 maybe raises their hands, because nobody's gone to Montessori school. I say, well, how many of you guys can put on your jacket? And everybody raises their hand. I'm like, wait, you don't need Montessori to learn how to put on your jacket? Like, what are you doing with your lives? Like, why are we spending hours talking about flip flop over the top and all these practical life skills? Every single thing that you teach young children to do in Montessori, every single person knows how to do. Why is it a big deal? And like, I mean, there are definite answers to that question, but that perspective is very fun. Like, once you kind of get your head around that, yeah, why are we doing this stuff? And what can you get out of it when you're 2 that you can't get out of if you learn it when you're 6? If you learn how to put on your jacket when you're 6, you're not going to get confidence out of it. But if you do it when you're 2, you will. And oh, that's interesting. Like, why is that? And what's going on there? Like, the whole process of figuring that out and thinking about that, it's both interesting for the 2-year-old, but also interesting for the adults who are kind of like thinking about it.
Well, so you've raised Montessori, and I wanted to talk to you about that, because my embarrassing admission of the day is that having had probably dozens of friends who teach Montessori, send their kids to Montessori, haven't sent my kids to Montessori for a number of years. I could not, if somebody asked me, what is Montessori? give them an answer. So you're going to be my educator in public as I admit to unforgivable ignorance.
Okay, what do you want to know?
Well, first of all, I mean, just like, I don't think you don't necessarily need to go in the history unless you think that's illuminating. But if
Yeah,
you're trying to capture what's distinctive about this approach to education that makes it different from what most of us are familiar with, what would you say?
I mean, Montessori is based on this idea that I just mentioned, that there's no knowledge that you don't create for yourself. The kind of deepest philosophical premise of Montessori is that human beings are self-creators, even from an extremely young age. What infants and toddlers are doing when they look around and are curious, they're building up their own faculties, they're building up their own capacities, they're slowly creating step by step, choice by choice, action by action, even when it's not conscious. It's by their own effort that they're creating the people that they will eventually become. And that's the starting point. And then you say, okay, given that people are on this self-creating path no matter what we do, what is the point of education? What can education do? How can education help? How can education help these beings who are self-creating? What do people really need? What makes for a good life? What kinds of things do people need to know? What kinds of things do you naturally encounter? What kinds of things do you not? And it's a whole system of pedagogy, of curricular materials, of learning materials, a whole approach to designing learning environments, to training teachers, to interacting with children, designed to be like rocket fuel for the child's self-creation. So it's not saying like, children are self-creating, so we just have to be hands-off and let them kind of figure things out. It's saying, children are self-creating, and like, how do we give them fertilizer, rocket fuel? How do we help them? How do we kind of nudge them here and there, give them power tools before they would otherwise get to them? How do we really think about and understand this process, which is pretty mysterious, like how it is that a young child grows into an adult, and hyper optimize it so that the child ends up super empowered, super independent, super resourceful, super knowledgeable, by their own efforts still, but they've had this optimal experience that's helped them really maximize their own potential. And there's all these different components that go into it. There's a specially designed learning environment with a special sequence of curricular materials that makes very abstract knowledge very concrete at a very early age. So Montessori believed that you could learn, generally, she thought that what you learned in high school, you should learn in middle school and elementary school, and what you learned in elementary school, you should learn in early childhood. She was just very ambitious about when you should learn things. And there's an approach to like the school day and the school structure where children, the curriculum and the resources are designed so that children are spending most of their time working independently and with independent motivation. And the lessons and the instruction that they're getting is very hyper-targeted and individualized to help speed that along. There's a much greater social aspect to Montessori education. The premise is that life is social, like not in like we all, not in some sort of like collectivist way. She's very, very individualist, but in the sense of human beings are incredibly valuable, incredibly important. The whole world revolves around complex interdependencies. How do you expose children to this young and get them kind of fluent in it and give them experience with it so that they experience it as a value?
Well, let me interrupt that right there, because I remember years ago, I'd read just a little bit of something by Montessori herself. It wasn't at the tactical level, but it was more philosophic. And then I was reading John Dewey. And now neither of them were using a lot of examples, which always makes it hard to get at exactly what their view is. But not only, but definitely on the socialization side, there was very similar language that was being used. And yet the Montessorians, I think, would distinguish themselves quite a bit from progressive education. But do you have a sense of like where the overlap is and where the distinction or differences might be?
I mean, this is a deep question. So there are a lot of Montessori educators. I am going to go into the history a little bit because I think it's illuminating. So in 1910, so Maria Montessori was a real person who did work in Italy, did a lot of innovative work in Italy. She was a doctor. She ended up working in education and did a lot of innovative things, and became very, very famous specifically for teaching slum children in her kind of pilot school how to read when they were 4 years old, which is not something that anybody at the time was even trying to do. Even amongst wealthy, privileged, aristocratic elite, it was like these were children that people had given up on, and she taught them advanced literacy skills. And so she got a lot of international attention, including in the US. She had a kind of big grassroots following in the US in the 1910s. And at the same time in the 1910s, the progressive education establishment, John Dewey and his students especially, were really coming to the fore and really making their critique of traditional education and really defining their school of thought. And they hated Montessori. And Montessori wasn't crazy about them either. And there were real intellectual disagreements between them. Montessori is more structured than most progressive education. She's more opinionated about what students should be doing when, how they should be using materials. The social aspect of Montessori, I mean, Montessori is, I mean, she talks about interdependence and socialization, and her whole, she thinks that that's a proper aim of education, and I do too. But her whole approach is, how do you get that? Like, what's the foundation of that? And the foundation of that is an independent self-confidence that's built out of, not out of the approval of others, not out of, but out of your working relationship with reality. And so she has this immense focus on children need to engage in concentrated work, meet their own needs, and feel efficacy and build up a sense of worth from that. And from that position, the whole social world opens up to you. You're friendly to people, you're generous, you don't feel insecure, you love other people, they love you. Whereas if you don't have that, if you feel incapable and you feel dependent on other people, you're nervous, you're anxious, like it doesn't work in the same way, much less in traditional education, with both Dewey and Montessori are critical of traditional education, which really sets up the school as like, you know, you're at war with adults, essentially. Like adults are telling you what to do and you don't want to do it. And that you're kind of, your whole experience to socialization is as a power struggle. That
was one thing that I guess it shouldn't have surprised me, but as I read Dewey, there was a real critique of what was the existing, you know, structure, and most bad movements work by false alternatives. But that the critique was often really good. So like the idea that we had this, which I think people who are critical of today's education system can kind of think, oh, there was this glorious period, you know, sometime in the past that got everything right, and then we've sort of abandoned it for this or that reason. Often they'll put it in political terms.
Yeah, I mean, traditional education is really bad in my view, and it's and there's a whole school of thought now around classical education or direct instruction. It goes under different headings, but that's kind of neo-traditional education, and this has been true for 100 years, but there's a kind of modern form of it. And it's a backlash against progressive education, and it's not, it's taking the other side of a false alternative. But yeah, I mean, Dewey's criticism of traditional education are good. I even think that Dewey's better generally than his students and followers have been. Progressive education now is worse than it was in the 1910s. That's just the way these things go.
So I think the aspects, if people are familiar of anything with Montessori, it's pretty much the very early. So like you mentioned the coat flip, which it really is adorable. The kids do that. But, and then kind of like, you know, like you could think living skills, right? You know, cleaning up a room or something like that. One of the critiques within the objectivist world has been that, well, Montessori is good at the very young ages, but after that, you can be more conceptual, more abstract, more advanced, and sort of Montessori is not good for that. Now I know the organization that you work with or for, you guys think certainly are not limited to the very early years. So how do you think about Montessori as a kind of like, in effect, preschool, kindergarten type of education versus a framework for thinking about education more broadly?
So what you see, I mean, this is similar to what we were just talking about. What you see in education is a swing from thinking that, like an unstable swing from thinking that this first thing that we talked about, like screw curriculum and like formal learning, like what matters is curiosity and learning how to learn and keeping that motivation in mind. It's the process, it's the learner, it's the agency, it's the choice. And it's about carrying that through for your whole life, critical thinking, effective critical thinking, motivated critical thinking. And that's progressive education. I mean, there's different forms of it, but that is the kind of view behind progressive education. And then there's the other view, which is, no, like you actually need to learn stuff. Like it's not just the process. There's things you need to know. It's important to know history and civics and math and STEM and the classics, and like there's a whole world to you that you need a grounding in, and it's immense value to have a grounding in, and you don't get it unless somebody teaches it to you. And screw all that motivation and critical thinking stuff. Like you can get that later, like, you know, and the swing, I mean, you see this, but I mean, you even see this at an individual level. You'll have teachers who are like, you know, fresh K-12 elementary teachers coming in and being like, I want to do project-based learning. I'm so excited. Like, it's going to be so exciting for the students. They're going to love school, and their students do love school. And then 6 months into the year, they're like, oh my God, my students aren't learning anything. I should do some standardized testing or some Common Core. Or you get the opposite. Teachers who are like, no excuses. I'm going to have high expectations of these students and teach them the basics. And then 6 months into the school year, they're like, oh my God, my students hate school and they hate me. And you need what Montessori does at the deepest level, and this has really worked out in early childhood, is she solves that dichotomy. She says, no, you can have high autonomy, high agency education, and high structure, high knowledge education. It's not like this is one dimension and there's a slider that you toggle and you pick where you fall in the trade-off. There's 2 dimensions there, and you can kind of maximize them both. And in early childhood, she has a system for doing this. It's a sequence of highly refined, you know, learning materials that she borrowed from educational psychologists of her time, and then worked and then improved upon, iterated on, to teach literacy, math, culture at a very, very early age, so that children end up being able to do, like, you know, triple-digit multiplication by the time they are in kindergarten, and advanced literacy skills, and know I mean, the amount that our children's health students know about geography that exceeds mine is embarrassing for me, and amazing for them. And the question is, what does that look like at the older ages? And in principle, I think it's the same issue. Like, you want high agency, high knowledge, high structure education. You want an education that is immensely thoughtful and highly designed in terms of what it's teaching students, how conceptual it is, how it introduces students to things, the knowledge that students are getting. And you want it to be incredibly self-motivated, incredibly inspiring. You do want it to result in transferable skills that you take with you your whole life. And that's, to me, what Montessori is. And so the question is just, there's a narrow question as to, like, how much of that did she develop? And I think she really developed early childhood, a little bit into elementary, but not so much. And so, yeah, more work is needed in elementary. Certainly more work is needed in adolescence. But the principle, what it should look like, is it should be high structure, high autonomy education. It should combine choice and motivation and knowledge and structure and rigor. And that's our whole, at higher ground education. That's our aim. That's our North Star.
Do you think that there's value to studying Montessori for somebody who, let's say, doesn't have children and is not going to be an educator?
Yeah, I mean, she's a, I mean, when I first found Montessori, which was really 8 years ago or so, it wasn't that long ago, I was really impressed with the Montessori classrooms that I saw. And I'm trained as an intellectual historian, so I'm like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to read all of her books and all of her epistolary, and she's a philosopher. I mean, she's a philosopher of human nature and of human development, who has a view as to what the good life is. She thinks that, for example, that having a positive relationship to work, production, love of labor, that grounding your self-esteem and your sense of meaning and life's purpose in your sense of work is really, really important at all ages. And she has a philosophical view as to this. And it's something that you kind of used to see in the 19th, early 20th centuries that you don't really see now, and that she has a lot of intelligent things to say about. She's a kind of Thomist, neo-Aristotelian, Catholic-ish philosopher. She's really, really worth reading.
Well, let me ask you about that for a second, because I mean, that's something I'm particularly interested in for my own reasons, but that is learning ways that a person can go about trying to understand a philosophic thinker like Montessori, or, there's a whole array of them. Obviously, my audience is very interested in Ayn Rand, but, like, for instance, I'm now, for my own personal indulgence, spending a long time sinking my teeth into Kant. How do you think about setting aside, like, taking a college university course where a teacher sits down and, teaches you about one of these figures? How do you go about tackling a new thinker who you're really trying to understand how they see the world?
Well, I have an immense amount of kind of context and examples from philosophy and intellectual history already. And I think that it's really hard to get into historical thinkers without some context, without some expert context. So like if you're going to study Kant and you're just going to sit down and read Kant, you can do it. And I wouldn't dissuade anybody from doing it. But it's a really good example of, man, is it helpful to have a teacher, or man, is it helpful to have a resource to guide you through it. And the same thing is true of Montessori. I mean, Montessori is at this point, at this late date in history, what stage of late capitalism are we in now? She's a historical figure. I mean, the audience that she was writing to is not you, and the context that she's writing in is not yours, and the whole intellectual context around schools has changed. And I mean, I teach a lot of Montessori, and I think that so I have a lot of experience with adults who are really interested in Montessori and really reading a lot of Montessori and even practicing Montessori, and who come to my courses, and I think like, yeah, like there's a lot about Montessori that you don't understand and I can help you. And that is part of what I'm trying to do. I'm going to teach a course in the fall on the history of education, specifically vis-a-vis Montessori, and kind of like providing intellectual context for Montessori. So that might be of interest to some people. If you're interested in Montessori, I mean, it depends on why you're interested in her. But if you're interested in her philosophy, she wrote a book called Spontaneous Activity in Education that's very, very philosophical. If you just want an overview, she wrote her own introduction to her work called The Discovery of the Child. If you're like a math person, she wrote an amazing math curriculum. You can find all the details all worked out in psychoarithmetic and psychogeometry, and it'll be really interesting to you. So if you're just approaching Montessori, I would say, what is your starting point? And then if you want particular advice as to like what to read and what to look at, reach out to me or do some research on your own and try to figure out kind of what the right entry points are.
Well, I like that you're doing the historic thing, because I've certainly found that getting that historic context is super clarifying. So like, I mean, I have the good fortune of, in studying Kant, I have you and our friend Jason, who study with like the greatest American Kant scholar, like whose works I can read and access as well, right? So I can get this context in effect, not as good as sitting in a classroom and talking to somebody like that, but it's very helpful. But then a lot of what I do is like read the biographies, read, the main people that Kant's influenced by, some of the German philosophers, and like Wolff.
I mean, like with somebody like Kant, even if you just have somebody to say, hey, you should read Manfred Kuhn's biography, and Paul Geyer's Intro to Kant is really good context, like that is not something that you can easily figure out just by Googling it. And so just, I mean, maybe you can, but like you won't always. And like, that's a really good starting point. And that's the kind of nudging that I would like to be able to give people with Montessori.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm kind of underlining this is I've talked to a lot of people who are very intellectually ambitious, and it goes back to the point about, people who are like more on the autodidactic side, that like there can be almost a, like you can call it, I think of it as the aspirational autodidact. Yeah. So they're not the actual Frederick Douglass, but they're somebody who's really intelligent, very ambitious, and then takes it as a point of honor that they like don't tap into existing resources to help you. And I find a tremendous value of those shortcuts that aren't like, they're not doing the work for you. So it's not like, well, I'll just read the Cliff Notes to the Critique of Pure Reason and then go on my merry way, or I'll just, watch this YouTube video, the Montessori in 5 minutes. Like, you actually do the work, but you try to build some of the context and get advice on, hey, what are some pitfalls that I might like easily walk into if I don't, know what I'm doing? Like, hey, exactly. By the way, you won't understand what Montessori is talking about unless you realize like there was this, movement she was responding to, or whatever the, particulars may be.
Yeah. And I think with Montessori in particular, the thing that I would say is that it's very easy and tempting to read Montessori today. And it sounds like you even did this a little bit, to read her as a progressive educator. And I think that is not right. Like, that is not a right interpretation of Montessori. And it's a misleading interpretation. It's going to kind of skew you towards noticing certain things in Montessori, not noticing other things in Montessori, and being confused about what's in the middle. And it's natural. It's not even like, when you're reading this, it's because you've been corrupted by some ideology. It's just it's a natural way to read her in today's context, because when she was first doing her work, there was no progressive education. And her arguments were aimed at people who were like, thought that children should be seen and not heard, and traditional education was on the, and now everybody thinks that sucks. And so everybody reads Montessori and they're like, yeah, this sounds great. I agree with Montessori. And you don't agree with Montessori. And it's fine to not agree with Montessori, but like kind of being able to see that as an intellectual skill, and an important one. And this is, I mean, part of my work is kind of like working out the implications of this. What does it mean to say that Montessori isn't a progressive educator, and what is her alternative?
So I'm going to ask, maybe it's a vague question. I intend it to be kind of wide and expansive, and you can take it how you want, but sort of the general relationship between an overall culture and education. And more specifically, I'm interested in how you see the opportunities for better education to address some of the problems that people are really worried about, in terms of the direction of today's culture.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I have kind of complex, mixed feelings about. So almost every idealist in history is tempted to see education as a kind of panacea, as like, this is like, if we can just get education right and raise kids right, everything else will be fixed. I mean, Montessori seems to have believed something like this. She wrote a book called Education and Peace, and she thinks, I mean, her view is that if we can just get education right, it will solve the world's problems. I don't think about education like that. I don't even think, I think it's dangerous to think about education like that to some extent. Education is about helping an individual child. And thinking that you can kind of, if you come into education thinking I can fix the world with education, you've got to be, and I mean, to some extent I think you can, to some extent I think you can't, but you've got to be very clear that like children are going to form their own views on ethics and politics and what's going to fix the world. And like, if your goal into getting into education is kind of, in effect, whether or not you explicitly realize this, if it's a way to get propaganda in early and more systematically, because you think that people need to believe certain things, you aren't going to miseducate children. Like, that is not how education should work. Education is about empowering individual children to reach their full potential over the course of their lives. And I think you have to take it child by child. And will that impact the world? Yeah, I think it will impact the world. I think it will have a tremendous impact on the world. But it's indirect. It's not like, I don't know, it's not like people will have better views on climate change or something like that.
Well, I think a lot of the way that, like, if you ask most people who are concerned about education, what are the problems with it? Certainly the ones that I hear, and obviously I'm coming from a biased sample, is usually the concern is, oh, they're getting propaganda. Like, it's not about educational methodologies. It's not so much about the kind of nature of education, but it's like, well, if they weren't, preaching that America is evil, or that, we're about to destroy the world with climate change and you should be telling mom and dad like to turn off the lights or something, then education, like, that would be fine. And I think we've at least touched on, like, that is so far from what I think the main issue in education is.
Yeah. I mean, education, the issues that you see today that I think are caused by bad education are at the level of people are terrified to think about and talk about whole huge portions of human life. That's the result of, education and kind of mixing with culture in a certain way. People, like, the rise of conspiracy theories is, I think, the kind of consequence that you see of education, and the reaction that people have against that is partially what you say. It's partially we need to teach better methods, but there are other reactions too. Like, we just need to teach children the right views on these things. Like, and that is like, even things like you said, like, we shouldn't be teaching children to hate America. Okay, so should we be teaching children to love America? Like, is the goal to kind of get to them first with your preferred view? or like what's the right way to approach that issue? That is a major pedagogical problem. And I don't mean problem in the sense of it's like something terrible is happening. It's like an intellectual challenge that needs to be solved, like how to help somebody develop healthy values without propagandizing them. And Montessori was actually really good on this.
Well, can we
Yeah.
pause on that for a minute and maybe take the issue of race? Because I know you guys have thought a lot about that, and it's an issue I think a lot about. And, there are, let's call it the two mainstream alternatives, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm not characterizing them right. But you can think of it as kind of the anti-racist narrative that like we need to be talking about race, and it's primarily an issue of white supremacy that's kind of shaped the institutions and ways of thinking. And then there's the kind of other side, which is basically like a rebellion against that, and like, no, you're overemphasizing race, and kind of saying like keep that the whole issue is in effect propaganda and shouldn't be a focus in the classroom. How do you think about that issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great topic. And I basically agree with how you're characterizing it. It so I think so if you kind of zoom out and you say, what do we need in the world? I don't think that what we need in the world is people who are hyper focused on and feeling incredibly guilty about and defining themselves by issues of race. I don't think that what we need in the world is people who are really annoyed at those people and who are steadfastly ignoring issues of race and trying to repress them out of public discussion, and try to kind of eliminate racism by kind of emotional fiat almost. More than anything, I mean, more than even either of those two schools, I think what we need are people who can actively and successfully think about issues of race, of identity, of and of diversity across issues, across cultures, across issues of gender and sexuality, and all. There's a bunch of different issues where diversity and identity come up. How do you think about that? How do you define yourself? How do you relate to your family, your culture, your history, the groups in which you were kind of born a part of? To what extent is there something there that you really want to identify with? To what extent is there something in another group that you really want to identify with that you're not naturally kind of born into and associated with? To what extent do you just want to say, screw all of that? I just want to think of myself as myself, and I don't even want to kind of engage in this process. There's a bunch of options that you have as an individual, and everybody knows people who grew up and who resented their family and who didn't want to be raised religious and who carved their own way, or who didn't, who like embraced their families and found a kind of healthy identity in that, or who, I mean, there's a million different options here, and it's not about the particular option. Like it's not about like, let me give you the one way to relate to your race, culture, and family. This is a complicated issue that's a deep matter of personal identity and agency, and you need to be able to think about it personally and successfully, and to carve your own path. And that is precisely the thing that nobody is helping anybody do in education. What you'd get in education is either nothing, like silence on it, and the status quo, which is like a skewed status quo, which is like, yeah, you could go through your entire education and never hear, I mean, maybe not now, this would be much less common, but 20 years ago, you could go through your entire education and not really hear about really powerful, successful women that much, and that could raise questions in your mind, questions that don't get talked about and don't get raised, and create certain kind of premises and bias. Or you get everything is about that. That's all we're going to talk about, and it's like a power structure. So it's not just like we're talking about identity. We're talking about identity from the presumption that the world is dominated by win-lose power structures that have to be deconstructed. You got to be able to think about all of that, and that means something different at different ages. But ultimately, what it means is that when you're an adolescent, you need to be able to put all of those on the table and say, there's a million different approaches to this. There's a million different arguments for these things, just like there are a million different philosophies and ethics and worldviews. Like, how are we going to approach this? How are we going to think about it? And what does it mean to you? And how are we going to help you do that? That's the kind of issue in a nutshell. There's more particular things to say about, I mean, I do think that the approach at the earlier ages is, and you want students to fall in love with humanity. And that implies something about, like, what does it mean to fall in love with humanity? Does it mean fall in love with a certain subset of humanity? Or does it mean to fall in love with all human beings? And do you need a certain kind of diverse representation of human beings for that to happen? How do you ensure that every single student identifies themselves as a human being and sees human greatness within themselves and within others? I mean, there are questions of race and diversity that come up, but they're pretty implicit and low key.
One thing that's come through in what you said now and throughout this interview is how much fresh thinking is necessary for like every aspect of education in order to do it well. Like Montessori is this great framework, particularly for the early years, but there's just so many issues that have to be thought about and figured out in an ongoing way. And so, one thing that I've noticed is that you'll often have, depending on how you assess this, but by various metrics, very successful particular schools. And it's usually you have a very passionate core group of people who've kind of become invested in it. And they're not the kind of people who just want to go home at 3 o'clock and like, go about their lives. They have a mission to do something great in education. But when these schools try to scale, even to a few schools, sometimes that breaks down and it's very hard, particularly to find teachers who are that passionate, that able to kind of think out the principles that the school's trying to pro- propel forward. And I know your school, I mean, you can give some of the numbers. I think people would be astonished to hear. Like you're growing really fast,
Yeah.
and to me, that always seems like or at least a huge hard problem to solve. Of how do you keep that kind of like investment and passion and encourage that kind of fresh thinking that has to be done in a world where the supply of teachers one would think who could do that are quite scarce.
Yeah, I mean, there's really two problems in education, and they're interrelated. So one is, what does it mean to get education right? And I think fresh thinking is needed there. I don't think that, like, when people talk about access in education and spreading what's good in education, I'm like, what's good in education that you're spreading? Like like, I don't think that we've got education right. And then there's the issue of scaling it and kind of increasing its reach. And how do you do that? And that requires its own kind of innovation. It requires innovation in training and pedagogical approach and structure. Um, and it's doable, but it's not like you can just take one classroom that's really working well and control C, control V it. And it's also not the case that no, it's too idiosyncratic to that teacher and that community, and it's impossible to scale. Like, I think you can scale these things, but it's a whole separate task to identify what's going right and what does it take to get it to scale, and what's the variation going to be when you scale it, and kind of how do you keep that variation on the high end of quality. But yeah, I mean, we're growing at 30 schools a year right now. I think we have 80 schools, most of which were opened in the last 3 years. Something like 70% early childhood, 30% upper school, elementary, middle, and high school. And these are hard problems, I guess. What do you want to know in terms of where the challenges are? Teacher training is a huge part of it.
Well, so that's one way that you have addressed it. So I remember, I don't know when you guys did this, but I remember when I heard it, I said, aha, that is super smart, which is like you bought and like invested in like the actual training programs for Montessori, as opposed to just relying on external people to feed you trained teachers.
Yeah,
Am I getting that right?
yeah, we're training about 1,000 teachers a year right now. And Montessori training is its own kind of cottage industry that exists largely outside of the normal education kind of teachers colleges, the institutes of training teachers. And we realized pretty early on that both the manner in which those trainings operate, but especially the scale at which they operate, wasn't going to be sufficient for us. And so, yeah, we're doing a ton with teacher training, and that's a lot of what I do. A lot of what I do is train teachers on Montessori theory, the history of Montessori, the philosophy of Montessori, and it's a big part of. It's just training. Like, it's like you can both overstate and understate the importance. Like, you still have to like find the right people to be in the training, and to build a great community around them, and to make sure that they have the resources that they need, and to also have patience. Like, it takes teachers time to develop and grow. And there's a whole system that you need to build around every part of that. But training is a big part. That's kind of like, the initial material that gets teachers started. It's the launch pad.
What has been challenging in your job that you didn't expect to be challenging or as challenging?
I'm an academic at heart. I mean, 10 years ago, I don't think I really knew what a manager was. Like, I guess my chair was my manager, but you know, I could teach basically what I wanted, and sometimes he would come in and check out on me, and nobody cared what I did, and I got to do what I wanted, and now I'm an entrepreneur. I mean, like this is, I mean, kind of what I'm doing now is, venture funded very much in the startup world. It's big growth. It's a moonshot, and every single aspect of kind of being entrepreneurial. Even though I'm still on the academic side of what we do at Higher Ground, but from fundraising to operations to issues of scale to just kind of issues of collaboration, all of that still feels new to me, even though it's not new anymore. I don't think I can say that in good conscience, but it's been part of the fun for me, is like learning how to be an entrepreneur. And it's something that I think, I mean, now I would do academia differently, kind of knowing what I know. But it's an awesome skill set.
Well, I think that's one thing that's very like it's certainly unusual in the field, right? There's certain fields where sort of like people go into because of like practitioner reasons. And so you often have people who are not thinking entrepreneurially or in a business way. They kind of like do that because they know they have to do it in order to pay the bills to some extent. But like, people who open restaurants, it's typically not like, oh, I want to run a great restaurant. It's, oh, like I want to be like a chef. And then I guess I have this business I have to run. And in education, I think you often have the same thing where there's people who are passionate about education, but in terms of like running a business, I think that's one reason why you don't see scale as often, though there have been some exceptions, I guess, on the charter side of things.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, we actually have one of our core values, our kind of core corporate values at Higher Ground, is practical idealism. And what that value says is, like everybody at our company loves teachers and they want to go in or loves children and they want to go in and they want to help children. And then what always happens to everybody in education is that's your goal and that's your mission. And then you get in and like your parents aren't on board and the air conditioner breaks and you've got a nonprofit board that's breathing down your throat and like nothing works how it's supposed to. And your children aren't like your parents are undermining what you do at home and blah, 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 blah. And at the end of the day, you're like, oh, like I have these ideals that I want, but the world is imperfect. And like, the world isn't good enough for my ideals. Like you become cynical. And that's endemic in education. You see a lot of cynical people in education who have ideals that they want to achieve and think that there are kind of insurmountable practical obstacles to achieving them. And what the value of practical idealism says is, fixing the air conditioner is precisely what your ideal demands of you. And that is why it's hard. And that is why it's challenging. It's part of the reason why we haven't had widespread education reform. Is it's an immensely challenging, practical, operational, financial, logistical thing to change the education of a culture. And it's part of what's needed. And it's part of what your ideal demands of you. And it doesn't come naturally to a lot of educators, that mindset and that perspective.
Yeah. And so I think that just the fact that you've assembled a team, and I don't know everybody, but I know a lot of people that you work with who I think have at least some elements of both, either naturally or at least by cultivation. Like that's such an unusual, like that's such an advantage at the goal that you're pursuing.
Yeah, it's a great team. And even within there's a whole world of education entrepreneurs, and it's an awesome world. So it's not just us. But I think that we're, the fact that most of us, and certainly as a company culture, we're kind of educators first, who have kind of adopted an entrepreneurial mindset, as opposed to being entrepreneurs who like education as our second career, and we kind of come into it and we try to figure it out, which is also very common, like very, very common in the edupreneur space, as people say, to be like a tech person who wants to come in and do education, or a real estate person who wants to come in and do education. And we're educators who want to be tech people and real estate people, basically.
Awesome. Well, thanks. How can people learn more about what you guys are doing and where they might actually be able to take advantage of your schools? Or I know you have even, I think, programs available for people who don't live where one of the schools are located, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we've got kind of nanny placement, homeschooling services, all sorts of things that you can avail yourself of. And if you're interested in Montessori training, you can take that remotely. As of this past year, so many things have been with the pandemic. You can do all of our training remotely now. Yeah, I mean, higherground.com is our website. And from there, you can find all of our different sub brands. There are no higher ground schools or training centers. Our training centers prepared Montessorian. Our schools are Guidepost or the Academy of Fun and Industry. But the quickest answer is if you just like DM me on Twitter or something, I can get back to you and answer your questions. I'm at Bateman, Bateman, like Batman with an E in the middle. And I'm pretty responsive. So
Awesome. Thanks, Matt.
yeah.